Hello and welcome to this British Academy event. I'm Hetan Shah, Chief Executive at the British Academy. I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Maria Sobolewska and Professor Rob Ford, both Professors of Political Science at the University of Manchester. Maria's areas of expertise include race and ethnicity in British politics, from elections to political representation. And Rob is an expert on immigration, public opinion and party politics in Britain. They've combined their considerable talents to write Brexit Land, which was published last year by Cambridge University Press. The title is how they refer to our divided nation, and the book argues that Brexit was a moment which crystallised the effects of long-term trends, in particular of educational expansion, ethnic diversity and the rise of mass migration, and growing generational divides in the electorate. So today, I'll be in conversation with both of them for about 40 minutes, after which we'll be taking a selection of audience questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please do that using the Q&A function. And please do tweet through the seminar as well. You can copy in handles for the British Academy, and Maria, Rob and I are all on Twitter. So Maria, Rob, welcome and thanks for joining me. Brexit Land was published in Brexit Land was published in September 2020. So for the benefits of our viewers and listeners, I wonder if you might start off by giving us a short summary.
Well, it's 400 pages, a short summary. So essentially what we're arguing is Brexit was the culmination of a very long set of interlinked processes of social and political change. So what came to the foreground in politics when we held the referendum over the EU was actually a set of new divides and shifting political alliances that have been building in the background for many decades before that.
That's a great short summary. So one of the things you say is that the 2016 EU referendum was the first national political choice structured primarily around identity divides. Could you elaborate a bit on that?
We know from the studying of British politics for decades that ever since the 1960s, it was widely accepted that class was the big question that everybody had to answer themselves. And when class started weakening, it became the economy. And even we had this famous quote, "It's the economy, stupid." And onto this, the political parties have positioned themselves. So one of them was on one side of the economic divide and the other one was on another. And when the political parties orient themselves around a political conflict, this makes that conflict easier for voters to negotiate and for everybody to choose from. Parties then know where they stand towards each other and towards this conflict. They position themselves very well on that. Brexit, as a question, should we leave the EU or should we stay in the EU, was a question that wasn't very easy to position on that economic spectrum. And we actually even talk about this in the book because this created a special problem for people who wanted to stay in the EU. They were trying to fit that question and their argument that we should stay in the EU as an economic one. Basically, they said to us, we will be better off in the EU, we should stay in the EU. But actually, on the leave side, it was a much deeper question. What kind of country are we? Who is allowed to come here? Who is allowed to stay? Who is British? Who is allowed to be the new British? Which direction is our country going to? And this exploded this question out of the economics, out of class, and onto those completely new questions.
And you were saying that in the book that 2016 was a moment of crystallization of those identities. Can you say a bit more about that?
Yes, so what happened in the referendum is, I think we call it a moment of awakening in the book, in a way. Essentially, people suddenly had a name that they could use to identify a set of things that they kind of had a sense of already in politics. I mean, it's quite difficult to remember that just 5 and a half years ago, there was no political meaning attached to the words remain and leave. They were just two fairly standard verbs in our language. Now they're probably the most politically meaningful terms in our entire political language. Nothing comes with more baggage attached than the words remain and leave. And we show that actually in the book in terms of the share of the population who can identify as remain or leave, and in terms of the attributes they associate with remain or leave. So what happened was divisions in outlook, divisions in values, divisions in background that were already existing in the electorate acquired a name and an identity. And that's important because that adds an additional layer on top of the divisions themselves. When people can identify and identify with a particular set of differences in background and outlook, that adds to the political power of those things. And that's what Brexit did to the electorate.
So, as you said at the start, the key argument of the book is that Brexit wasn't a moment to be understood in isolation, but was, in a sense, the culmination of some quite deep, long-rooted trends. Can we spend a bit of time just kind of unpacking what those trends are and what was it that actually drove that moment in 2016?
In the book, we divide those trends into two main groups. The first group is sociological, and we are talking about a society that has been changing very significantly since the Second World War. And a second set of those trends are political. And these are some universal trends that we observed in other countries as well at the same time, around the 1990s, and some very specific things that our political parties have done that have put them on a certain trajectory. So maybe we should start with those sociological trends. And the main two sociological changes that we've experienced in the last 60, 70 years has been the huge rise in diversity. So we have experienced going from almost an entirely white nation into a very ethnically diverse nation. And especially some of our cities have become what is now called super diverse. So we are not just looking at a city like London thinking, oh, there's some minorities living in some neighborhoods. Basically, there are very few neighborhoods that have only one ethnic group in them. And this is a huge change when you think about it on paper. When you look at those graphs we put in the book with the huge trend lines on graphs, but actually it's a huge change to human life, everyday life. We have kids now growing up in schools which are diverse. They have friends from all sorts of religions, all sorts of ethnic groups. That didn't used to be the case, even though there were, of course, some people from other ethnic and religious origins in this country. Very few people would have encountered them in everyday life. We have that in schools now, we have that in the media, we have that in places of work and everywhere we go. And especially, as I said, if we live in those urban environments. And the second trend that we highlight in the book is the growth of education. All levels of education have grown. So we have gone from a society where the majority of people have left school at 16 or earlier without any qualifications into a nation where I think it was last year for the first time, 50% of 18-year-olds applied to go to university. This is an enormous change. And we talk about how this is not just the kind of change that causes people to have different jobs, but also causes them to move to those super diverse cities. So they start living amongst that diversity a lot more, leaving behind very often and imposing that brain drain, so to say, on those smaller towns that don't have buoyant economies, don't have knowledge-based economies. And so these geographical areas experience less diversity and less kind of rise of education. And what we're starting to see is geographical polarization. We have super diverse cities that have globalized economies and huge knowledge economies. And we have those smaller places that do feel, to refer to the common theme, they do feel left behind. And on those two sociological changes, they really are.
So those were the sociological changes, and then you talked about a second set of changes as well. Rob, do you want to comment on those?
Yeah, so the second set of changes is the changes that have been underway in terms of party politics. And this is where you take sort of general sociological changes, which incidentally, of course, have also been happening in other countries. and you move on to a more path-dependent track that's more to do with the specifics of British history. So in Britain, we've seen a number of things that have opened the door for disruptive political change of the kind that we've seen in the last 5 to 10 years. One was a convergence in the mainstream political parties, which dates back to the New Labour era. Ideological convergence on the one hand, but also convergence in the kinds of people who were becoming MPs, which also links up to the kinds of trends we're talking about. So 30 or 40 years ago, a pretty decent minority of the Labour Party's parliamentary benches were filled with people who didn't go to university, who left school at 16, and who came in from very often blue-collar trade unions. The share of MPs that have that kind of background has really slumped since the New Labour times. So as well as the ideological convergence, which everyone knows about with New Labour, there's also a convergence in the kinds of people who are becoming MPs and the kind of backgrounds they're coming from. And that in turn inclines them to a much more identity liberal outlook on life than many of their voters have. The second big change comes in immigration politics. And here the story is a little bit more complicated and unique to Britain, because uniquely in Britain, we had a centre-right party that became very strongly associated very early on with immigration control, which was the Conservative Party in the wake of Enoch Powell and also Margaret Thatcher's first term in office. That meant we didn't have immigration control as a kind of radical right, anti-system politics mobilization device in the way that very often happened in much of Europe. Instead, voters who wanted immigration control, what we call the identity conservative ethnocentric voters who are prone to see immigration as a threat, they tended to be channeled into the Conservative Party's electorate. That changed after the 2010 election because of the pledge made by David Cameron and Theresa May to bring immigration down to the tens of thousands, a pledge which they should have known was not deliverable given the immigration policy framework we had. And that in turn led to a kind of delayed mobilisation on the radical right via UKIP. And at that point, it became possible for UKIP, who of course started as a Eurosceptic party, to argue that immigration control required departure from the EU. And that produced that fusion of issues, national sovereignty, immigration control, departure from the EU, which then fed in to the debate that we had in 2016 and after over Brexit.
That's a fascinating account, and as you say, can see a real path dependency there. In the book, you've already started mentioning these, in a sense, there's three clusters of voter identities that you talk about. I wonder if you might just say a bit more about them and what defines each one of them.
We have three little groups, and before I yes, no, actually they are not as big as you'd think. So we make this point very strongly in the book, but it often gets taken out of context. So I'm going to underline it again, that we don't envisage that everybody in the society comes into one of these three groups, right? They are ideal types, and they describe a voter that is, that fits ideally into this, but also that might be on the edges of this group. And of course, there are some people who are between and not quite in belonging. But for the sake of arguments of organizing ideas, we have these three groups. And the first one is identity conservatives. What we mean by this is those are the people who live in those smaller towns, often, that do feel left behind. They do have lower levels of education. So, of course, because all levels of education have grown, we are calling them often school leavers, but they don't possess no qualifications. They have simply less qualifications than kind of A-levels, and certainly not a university degree. And these people often think that immigration is a threat to them. It is a threat in terms of their kind of economic well-being, but what is much more significant to us, it is a threat to what they would recognize as British culture, what they would say is their culture, the country they know. And this is the group that I think gets often talked about. So this is the group that has, books written about it. And so to counterbalance this, we say, well, it's not asymmetrical. On the other side of our society, we do have people who we called identity liberals. They are the very people who are opposite, who are very well educated, often live in those super diverse urban environments, but what's more, they love it there. They absolutely think diversity is a great thing. They often would say that they want more of it. And they certainly think that, if anything, that diversity improves Britain. They would say things like immigration is great for British culture. And they probably also think that it's good for British economy and their own kind of position in life as well. And within this group is very interesting because we do think that generally this group is formed by this kind of mirror opposite to the identity conservatives. But there is one exception from this mirror image of identity conservatives, and that is ethnic minority in this country. And we called them, we basically split the identity liberal group into two, and we called the people who are white and highly educated and love diversity as a matter of political value, we call them conviction liberals. However, the ethnic minorities are much more complicated on this, because even though in arguments about race and immigration, they often are very liberal, they are not necessarily actually the very well-educated lovers of diversity per se. Ethnic minorities in this country include groups that are immigrants themselves, for example, and are absolutely huge supporters of multicultural policy and racial diversity, but they are very traditionalist on many other issues that identity liberals would reject. So some of them are very religious, and you have to remember that generally speaking, ethnic minorities are a lot more religious than white British people. So they would, for example, be opposed to increasing gay equality legislation, and they would be much more traditional on gender roles. And so as a result, we think they have actually a lot in common with a lot of identity conservatives. But because British politics, the way it is organizing itself around issues of identity, the two big issues are immigration and race. They belong as a kind of in a coalition, so to say, with the conviction liberals.
That's really fascinating. And developing this theme of the importance of immigration and race, in the book you point to the first wave of mass migration in the 1960s as critical for understanding more recent events. Could you say a bit more about that?
Yes, I mean this comes back to the point about the things that set Britain apart a little bit, and another thing that sets Britain apart a little bit is that immigration to Britain began a little bit earlier, and the mechanism of migration was a little bit different. It was the 1948 British Nationality Act, which basically gave citizenship rights to people across the former imperial colonies of that time, current and former imperial colonies at that time. So the whole Indian subcontinent, much of the Caribbean, large parts of Africa, and so on. And we point out that one of the things that sets apart identity conservative voters, and one of the psychological forces that we think has been understudied and underestimated in politics, is what we call ethnocentrism. It's this tendency chronically to see politics, to see social conflict in terms of us in groups against them out groups, and a kind of chronic tendency to react defensively to a perception of threat from the arrival of new outgroups. And what we saw in the first wave of immigration was exactly that psychological and political dynamic playing out. Pretty much from the outset, there was a very strong hostile public reaction in a big part of the British public to the arrival of large numbers of migrants from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, the Caribbean. But for a long time, that wasn't mobilized politically, because the other force we talk about in the book is the power of anti-racism norms. And the political class of the 1950s and 1960s featured an awful lot of people who had literally just been fighting in a war against what they regarded as racist nationalist politics. So they were very, very strongly averse to acknowledging or responding to what they regarded as a sort of variant of the same pathology in their own electorates. And it wasn't until Enoch Powell came along and gave very visceral voice to this kind of sentiment in the public that it became an issue that was mobilized into politics. So we think the first wave of immigration is pivotal for two reasons, really. Firstly, because it illustrates the dynamics that we think have played out again recently, that this isn't just unique to the current time period. It's happened before because it reflects general tendencies and general divisions in the electorate. But secondly, because of the legacies that were left by that period. The legacy on the right of associating the Conservative Party with a kind of ethnocentric nationalism and with immigration control, and the legacy on the left of associating the Labour Party, who were at best ambivalent about Commonwealth migration actually in the 50s and 60s, but by the 1970s, particularly the 1980s, were very firmly associated with fighting back against that kind of ethnocentric tendency. So they became the party both of anti-racism and of ethnic minority interests. And that settled pattern is what we came into the current period with.
It's also worth adding to this that one of the legacies of this period was also the positioning of the political place of ethnic minorities in this country, because they started coming as citizens with equal political rights. It always became a conversation about unraveling their status and limiting their rights. And so the conversation wasn't, as it would be elsewhere in Europe, about giving them rights. It always is about taking things away. And that makes a huge difference, because to this day, we have a unique in the world law, which basically says any legally resident citizen of a Commonwealth country can vote in general election. And so Europe, that has similar numbers of ethnic minorities, some of the European countries like Belgium, they are not significant proportion of their electorates yet, because only now it's the new generations who apply for citizenship, and the Germans are still arguing about the political status of the guest workers in terms of their citizenship. However, here, because they initially came as citizens, they were always given those rights. And those rights, even though they've been rolled back in terms of citizenship eligibility, they have not been rolled back in terms of their eligibility to vote. And as a result, this growing proportion of our population is a political player that political parties do have to take into account.
And earlier, Rob, you were sketching out how the political parties have responded in different ways to some of these emerging dilemmas. Could you say a bit more, especially over the last decade, how that's played out with the Conservative Party, the Labour Party, and the rise of UKIP?
Yeah, well, it's been a very difficult dilemma for both parties, because these divides cross-cut very strongly the traditional divides of class and income and region that have traditionally split the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. And as a result, what you've seen in both parties is a big internal conflict about how to respond to and address these new divisions. So the decade just gone of the 2010s actually began with the Conservatives agonising about how to improve their appeal to ethnic minority voters, to young voters, to what we call identity liberals, younger cosmopolitan-oriented graduates. That was part of the David Cameron project, was to appeal more to their voters. But ironically, it was the failure of that project that delivered their election wins, because instead their mobilisation around immigration control first, and then more strongly around Brexit, enabled them to win over sections of the identity conservative electorate that had previously voted for Labour. But that earlier problem hasn't gone away. In fact, it's got worse. So the Conservative Party's electorate has become bigger in the past 10 years, but it's become bigger by becoming very much older. It's pretty much just as white, even as the electorate has diversified. And younger graduates in particular have become very antipathetic towards the party. And that basically leaves them on the wrong side of demographic change. So it's a winning strategy in the short run. And of course, when you're talking about demographic change, the short run's quite a long time. So they could carry on winning with that kind of strategy for another decade or more easily. But in the long run, it's a big problem for them because, well, quite frankly, if the voters who are like under 40 are mostly large majority against the Conservative Party, that's the majority of the electorate in the future. On the other side of the coin, the Labour Party began that decade agonising about how to renew its appeal to socially conservative voters who are worried about immigration. If you go back and look at the debates that Ed Miliband was having and his advisors were having over immigration in the early 2010s, it was the same kinds of concerns being expressed by the same kinds of voters as we saw in 2017 and 2019 with Labour agonising about the so-called Red Wall, the Labour Leave voters. So these were not new internal fractures. But just as the Conservatives, the Conservatives failed in their renewal project and won, Labour failed in their renewal project and lost. And one of the reasons for that is that Labour also have a disadvantage from geography, which is one of the things that's helping the Conservatives to, as it were, hold back the tide of demographic change. Because one kind of unhelpful political feature of the groups that Labour is now concentrating its support in is that they all tend to live in the same places. So if you look at what's happened to the Labour vote in seats like the one we're coming to you from now, Manchester, Withington, or many of the seats on the outer fringes of London, Labour's majorities have absolutely soared in the last decade. But under first past the post, enormous majorities amount to wasted votes because they aren't helping you to get additional seats in the Commons. Whereas the kinds of votes that the Conservatives have improved their appeal with are evenly distributed across the whole country. Now, in the long run, that problem begins to correct itself because the electorate sort of grows that Labour's appealing to. But again, the long run is a long time. So right now, both parties are stuck between their historical legacies of the strength of their support and the long-term impact of demographic change on where their support is going. And so in both cases, there's a long-term project they should probably engage in to address their appeal to some of the rising groups, renew their appeal. But there's always a short-term temptation to avoid that because there's always going to be a very difficult argument to have internally, and parties prefer to avoid difficult internal arguments if they can.
That's really interesting. And before I ask my next question, just to remind our viewers and listeners, in about 10 minutes, I'll be opening up to audience Q&A. We've already got a few questions coming in, but do put them into the Q&A function and we'll pick those up shortly. One of the things that I think sort of after the referendum was very much debated in the media was the question of how far was what happened to do with economics and how far was it to do with people's self-identity, as it were. How would you characterize the sort of balance between those two things? Or is that actually the wrong way of framing it? Is that a false dichotomy in some way?
So this is one of those typical social science problems that is extremely difficult to disentangle those two things entirely. But we think that there is a certain almost naivete in people on the left wanting to believe that if only everybody was economically advantaged, things that they don't like ethnocentric attitudes and dislike of people who are different would disappear. And we do think this is a very naive perspective. And I think, in fact, there has been research from Professor Jane Green showing that actually there was a very solid support for Brexit from the wealthy as well. So again, when we have those kind of big headline findings of, the left behind areas that are economically deprived voted Brexit, we have to remember it doesn't mean that it was this economic deprivation that caused this, and it wasn't just those areas that have voted. And we also believe that economics receives always more attention. And I think we're going back to the beginning when I said politics and elections, the study of elections is so reliant on this idea that it's the economy stupid again. So we are trying to say that it wasn't, in fact. So we argue in the book that, and I think Rob already mentioned this theory called ethnocentrism, and that is to do with how people think about society in terms of groups. And we certainly see from a huge amount of American research on this, but there's also some European research showing that around 30% of population are just, they do have a tendency to be very strongly ethnocentric. And we do have this initial response in ourselves when we see a new person, for example, to almost immediately try to say to ourselves, is this us? Is this one of us? Is this an in-group member? Or is this somebody who might threaten me and my family and my tribe? And then we have people on the very other end of the spectrum And again, just like those identity conservatives and identity liberals, those people who aren't ethnocentric are the understudied group often. So we are trying to make an effort to actually study them as well and find out what it is about them that makes them open to diversity, that makes them value diversity. And this is where we think that one of the big things that they have is that they have a very strong sense of social norms, and they think that rejecting people based on difference, especially difference that they cannot help, like their race or religion they were raised in, that is a moral wrong. And so these people have a very strong sense to what we call motivation to control their prejudice. So they would think it is extremely important from a personal point of view to identify as a person who will not be prejudiced, who won't be racist. And again, as ever, there's a huge amount of people in the middle, some of them closer to one end than the other. But generally speaking, because these two very extreme ends of the spectrum are the loudest arguers, and they are having the kinds of arguments that are about what's right and wrong, so these are very heated arguments, very emotive arguments, we do often assume that it means that everybody is one or the other. But again, it is a spectrum. However, those ethnocentrics, they could be very rich or they can be very poor. And in fact, they can be left-wing and they can be right-wing. So the one big thing that's been driving Brexit has been a thing that we have not been even measuring in social surveys in this country. So we have measured all sorts of attitudes towards pretty much anything. But I think, is it only in the 2005 that the British election study starts including questions about immigration again, having dropped them in the 1980s? So as you can see, those questions of identity, questions that weren't about economics, were simply not asked. We weren't studying them at all.
Well, I think your book has made a major contribution to helping us understand this, and some lazy narratives that we picked up, or uncertainties we had straight after 2016 around it was the left behind and it was an economic vote. I think you've really helped correct that, which is very important. And turning back to migration, could you say a bit about how attitudes to migration have shifted? I mean, there's interesting polling data post 2016, which suggests that people's concerns have dropped significantly. What's your explanation for that, given migration itself didn't necessarily drop as dramatically as all of that? So take us through some of that.
Well, I mean, this actually nicely follows on from the point about, is it economics, is it social psychology? Because before writing this book, one of the things I wrote a lot about was immigration, and you had exactly the same debate for the best part of a decade. Was opposition to immigration being driven by economic anxieties about immigrants, or was it being driven by something deeper and more about us against them psychology? And you tended to get a situation where basically everyone who was attached to politics or policy just wanted it to be about economics because they could say things about economic policy. But the voters just weren't playing ball on this. It wasn't how it played out. The voters who were most concerned about immigration simply weren't the voters who actually faced any kind of direct or indirect threat from economic competition from immigrants. What was driving it was this perception of immigrants as a kind of threatening outgroup. And I think what's happened since 2016, which has been quite surprising, I mean, we're still unpacking it. First of all, I want to say, as someone who worked in immigration for a long time, I did not predict this. I would not have expected the shift to have been as big as it was. But what it does point to, I think, is the really very powerful importance of political symbols when you're talking about people's perceptions about what is and isn't threatening in society. So the vote to leave basically sends a very powerful signal to these more ethnocentric voters that a phenomenon that they regarded as threatening and out of control, which was mass immigration, was now going to be brought under control and brought under the control of a national government that shared their kind of political outlook and sympathies. Therefore, even though the objective phenomenon itself did not change for the next couple of years, there was no decline in immigration in general after 2016. Obviously, there has been more recently, but 2016 through to 2019, no decline in net migration, no decline in migration from Europe. Free movement migration continues through the transition period. These voters, nonetheless, no longer see it as a urgent political problem because they believe that the necessary levers that they want to see pulled to exercise control over that issue are now in the hands of the people that they trust to control it. So that, I think, is a really important riposte to the kind of people who want to make this all about economic policy. Is if you make it all about economic policy, the risk is that you pull on the wrong levers, nothing happens, and then you can assume nothing can be done. Whereas once you know it's about psychology and symbolic politics, there's actually a whole different set of levers that you can pull to try and address these voters' anxieties and concerns that can have a very different effect, even if the underlying phenomenon itself is continuing in a similar way, because it's understood in a different way.
Let me ask a final question before I turn to, I can see lots of questions coming in from people who are viewing the event live today. In the conclusion to Brexit Land, you talk about further areas which you hope will be researched in more depth. And one of those that you point to is geography. Could you say a little bit about how you think the role of geography will play out around all of this issue of identity and social identity politics in Brexit Land?
Geography is an interesting one because we do talk a little bit in the book about how these huge social changes that we've documented in books, so the rise of ethnic diversity and the rise of education, they do tend to correlate in the same geographies. So what is happening is that we do see that the cities, certain geographies, I hesitate to use the word cities because it could be towns that have universities or other knowledge economy hubs in them, but they seem to be departing from the rest of the country in terms of how they look and how they feel and the kinds of economies that they have. And of course, with it, also the kinds of political values that they have, the kind of political parties that they will want to vote for, the kinds of political ideas that they have. The problem here is that it is such a complex reality when we think about it. So our book talks about values the most and parties the most. However, there are those underlying questions of economy, for example, which are fascinating, and we don't want to completely throw it out as a baby with the bathwater. So discussing the kinds of economic consequences of these polarizations is very important. And I think one of the important things that certainly some think tanks have started doing, for example, is trying to think about whether these towns can be given an alternative positive story and an alternative positive identity that would compete with those globalized diverse cities as a positive thing that would and could attract people to move into those towns, investments to move into these towns and so on. So what we are seeing in those polarized times is that there is only one story and people place themselves on either end of this story. And this story is about identity and culture wars, it's sometimes called, and it is about are we racist, are we not racist, what is racist, is waving a flag racist, is it not racist? But there are multiple other stories about identities that can be told, and it doesn't have to be, identities don't have to be about race and immigration. And we actually do use a few examples of this in our book, where we talk about how those ethnocentric voters can include racial groups within the in-group. They are becoming much more tolerant. It's not just those identity liberals that are racing ahead, leaving everyone behind with unchanged values and attitudes. They do change those values and attitudes, just much more slowly, and they are not, quite as on board with all these expanding definitions of racism and all the other kind of political ends of it. But there is a positive story to be told, I think, on other identity values in politics. And we use Scotland, in fact, to leverage this example. In Scotland, we see the same social change. We see the same ethnocentric voters with absolutely identical dislike of others. But the other in Scotland is not immigrants and ethnic minorities. The other in Scotland is the English. And in fact, the English in this context became the Tories from Westminster that are, damaging our beloved Scotland. And so that same debate, this very same people having a very similar conversation, but the aim of this conversation is different.
Well, that's fascinating, and does mean that policymakers need to think about the country in really quite a different way. Now, let me turn to some questions we've got coming in from our viewers. Oliver Phelan says, I'd be interested to hear Rob and Maria's perspective on recent reports that Labour should focus on presenting itself as a patriotic party and reclaim symbols like the Union Jack. So, what's your advice to the Labour Party on how to approach winning over these ethnocentric or red wall voters?
Well, this is one that actually the pair of us have discussed amongst ourselves a little bit. We took slightly different views on it, but I think we've arrived at a consensus in the traditional way of Maria persuading me that I'm wrong. Essentially, there's a very good case for this kind of patriotic symbolism in theory, which is, a lot of this stuff, there's a very large majority of voters that express positive views about it, including large parts of the identity liberal population will express pride in patriotic symbols, pride in the flag, and so on and so forth. So there's a case for Labour, sending out positive mood music about this kind of thing. But the problem that you get with it, increasingly so, particularly within the Labour Party, is that problem of internal conflicts and division that I alluded to earlier as well. There is a section of the Labour electorate and the Labour activist base that is very intensely cosmopolitan and sort of intensely suspicious of patriotism as a potential gateway into more divisive and ethnocentric politics. And they tend to get very, very vocally skeptical about anything like this. And indeed, that's exactly what we saw playing out. We saw Richard Burgon and the Socialist Campaign Group expressing concerns that this kind of thing would alienate other parts of the Labour electorate. I think really putting into other people's mouths their own concerns, actually. But that in turn, regardless of the degree to which those views are broadly shared, and often they aren't that broadly shared when you're talking about very unifying symbols, that kind of undermines the whole point of the project in a sense, because it makes the signal no longer credible, because it basically looks like one part of Labour is saying, well, we agree with and sympathise and share these values, and then another part of Labour saying very loudly, no, we don't, and we don't want to say that. Which kind of renders the whole thing a little bit pointless, because it won't work with the voters whose suspicions it's aimed to overcome.
Okay, we've got a question from Kenny Gilchrist, who says, you use the word Brexit Land for the title of the book, but he would argue that the book is more about England and the political discourse within England. So how far would you say this is about England rather than about the United Kingdom?
We do use the word Brexit Land because we are talking about a Brexit referendum. So I guess that's one way of explaining it. We do actually have a chapter on Scotland, and I already mentioned that we use Scotland as this example of the same kind of society arriving at a very different identity politics issue, one that is absolutely liberal towards immigrants and people of different races, but picks on the Tories as the other that they find threatening, the English Tories. So it's not entirely only about England, but we know that in England and Wales, really, it was the conversation about immigration and diversity in the way in which we presented in the book. It was in these two constitutive nations predominantly. We don't really spend much time talking about Wales, and we did absolutely exclude Northern Ireland because of their identity politics being so complicated, and also the data's not really very good on it. But yeah, so to an extent, but we do think it generalizes, and in fact, we would argue it generalizes beyond England into Europe. This is one of my favorite topics of conversation, actually, with European scholars who refuse often to engage in conversations about race, saying things like that it doesn't exist and we shouldn't say that it does. And I say, well, I agree that it doesn't exist. It's a social construct, right? But the societies nonetheless have constructed this construct and use it to perpetuate racial disadvantage and racial prejudice, for example. And therefore, we must talk about it because, simply looking the other way. So from my perspective, Europe is just behind us, but they are following in our footsteps. The only thing that they have that is quite significantly different in terms of politics is, of course, the party systems. So they have, unlike with UKIP, which never got any parliamentary representation, most European countries now have somehow included their far-right parties, anti-immigrant parties, into their parliamentary kind of systems, and so they are kind of put to one side, so to say. So it's unlikely to result in a huge explosion like the Brexit referendum, but it'll certainly stay with them as well.
And following on from, in a sense, the discussion about England, John Newham asks about Scottish nationalism and your kind of prognosis as to how that might play out.
Well, I mean, one thing to say a little bit is that it's too soon to tell. But what we sort of set out in our Scottish chapter is Scotland is very interesting for two reasons. Firstly, they've experienced two very different mobilisations of us against them politics. First around the independence referendum and then around Brexit. And the second cut across the first. So one thing the SNP underestimated when they immediately responded to the vote to leave, they saw that 60% of Scots had voted to remain. They saw that the majority of the English had voted to leave. They said, oh, well, this is great. This plays right into our existing narrative of Scotland and England are different and England doesn't respect Scotland's interests. What they underestimated was the segment of the Scottish electorate that voted to leave the UK and voted to leave the EU. Because the most ethnocentric section of the Scottish electorate doesn't want to be ruled by foreigners in London, but doesn't want to be ruled by foreigners in Brussels either. That's two different outgroups as far as they're concerned. And they don't want to exchange one form of foreign rule for another one. That was actually a fairly substantial minority of the independence yes vote. And much of that minority bolted from the SNP coalition and went and voted for the Conservatives, which is part of why the Conservative vote there rebounded. So that's where we are today, is a situation where you've still got those two cross-cutting divides, but we're increasingly, the SNP's electorate is increasingly a consolidated identity liberal electorate, and the unionist vote is a consolidated identity conservative electorate, with the Labour Party largely being pushed out. But whether or not that leads to a yes for independence, the problem the SNP have is a second unique feature of Scottish politics, which is that there's a segment of the identity conservative Scottish electorate, the oldest section, that feels British before it feels Scottish. So for them, us is still Britain. And that's a difficult section to win over. The advantage the SNP has had is that neither Labour nor the Conservatives until now have found a very effective way to appeal to that segment of the electorate. And of course, in the first independence referendum, the whole Project Fear project was built around economic appeals. But if we had another independence referendum, it's quite possible that the appeal that would be made against independence might be focused more on these kind of identity-based appeals. It would certainly fit more with the way the Conservative Party is now, to make a sort of appeal to unionism less on economics than on group membership and identity and so on, the history of Scotland within Britain and so on. So it could play out differently. All of that said, though, of course, they do go in with a major advantage over last time round, which is that they've won over a big chunk of the most pro-EU Scots, who are now, more firmly in the independence camp because they see it's the only way to get back into the EU.
Yeah. Now, continuing on this theme, Maria, you talked about what's happening in Europe. Paul Nugent has asked about the parallels in the kind of political and social developments here with what's happened in the US over the last 20 years. So he's just asking, can you speak a bit to how you see the similarities and differences? And he's asked whether you write an American version yourselves or if somebody else is working on that right now.
So actually, one of the first things that I did do, and in fact, from my side, it led me towards writing this book. Obviously, I can't speak for Rob, was that I was asked after the election of Donald Trump, I was asked to talk about the parallels between Brexit and Trump. And certainly, we took these parallels very seriously. Obviously, the societies we live in are very, very different. And I think this is something that doesn't get said enough, in a sense that the history of ethnic diversity of this country is hugely different, of course, but also the levels of all those things that we're talking about. So the levels of racism, the levels of political violence, or police violence, the levels of inequality in terms of political inequalities, political rights, but even some socioeconomic inequalities, particularly in housing, for example, they are world apart. American society is hugely structured around race in a way that our society isn't. And it's not to deny the evils of racial disadvantage, but just to put this kind of, whatever parallels we can talk about, they are not one-on-one comparisons, right? So in a sense, we do see those parallels in ethnocentric mobilization around race, around immigration, and its expression that was found through the Republicans. And of course, the Republicans, even going further back in time, had huge parallels with the Conservative Party in worrying about lack of support from ethnic minorities there. And so that, because we have a two-party system, we do have those almost necessary comparisons, right? And even the fact that we are talking about things like race, unlike Europeans who are iffy about that as well. So there are huge comparisons in geographic polarization as well in the US. So we again see urban environments, globalized cities, economically successful cosmopolitan centers with universities voting in a completely different fashion than here. But when we look at the British politics, Brexit and Trump, yes, but our normal elections and Trump, not so much, right? So we still have a political system that's not entirely lent and reprogrammed itself around Brexit. And we saw in 2017, for example, that there was some resistance. And in 2019, that election was the proper Brexit election. But there is no guarantees that the next election will also be around those lines. We might well be coming back to economy, in which case we again moving further away from the US, right? And it's not becoming the most important area of conflict in British politics. So, yes, I think with the US, I'm absolutely there immediately, but then I pull myself back always and think we shouldn't go too far down that rabbit hole.
Well, there does seem to be demand if you ever want to write a book on it. Our listeners and viewers are interested. I think probably the final question will go to Roy Livingston, who says he's interested in your description of identity liberals and identity conservatives, and that higher education plays a very important role in the sort of differentiation between them. So he asks, what do you think is either missing from school-age education or is available in higher education that contributes to this? So if you can unpack that process a little bit more.
Well, it's a very good question. And indeed, I've got a PhD student who's working on exactly this issue at the moment. Ralph Scott is doing some fantastic work on this. It's actually really difficult to unpack exactly what is driving this higher education effect, because you've got a number of things all happening at once. It's the curse in social science that a whole bunch of things happen at once. The kinds of people who go to university are not the same as the kinds of people who don't very often, so there's a sorting effect. But then there's also an effect of the experience in the classroom, in the lecture theatre, in the virtual lecture theatre as it now is, within the university sector, being on campus. But then there's a broader socialising effect of moving to a new city, meeting people from different backgrounds. So you've got three different sets of processes all rolling at the same time. What Ralph has already been able to establish, and this has been found in other research as well, is that a big part of this does seem to be down to like what people actually experience when they become students in higher education, both inside the classroom in terms of the kinds of courses they do, and outside the classroom in terms of the fact that they've moved to a new place, they make new networks of friends and stuff like that. And in terms of the kinds of identity politics we're talking about, my speculative hypothesis would be that it's particularly that latter thing that matters. Mobility, new social networks, new social experiences, leading people to question and rethink some of the identities and values that they've grown up with. Now, the people who go to university will often be the people who are most open to that kind of thing anyway, so that further increases the division. But the people who stay home, they never go through that process of uprooting and questioning and reconsideration, and that leads them to, much more settled identities, and perhaps more suspicions of things that fall outside of those identities. So I don't think it's something that can easily be written into the curriculum. Is the problem. I mean, maybe the best way, and we used to do a lot of this in Britain when I was at school here years ago, is the exchange programs, to spend time with the family abroad when you were learning a foreign language. I mean, foreign language learning has gone off a cliff in this country, but if it was to come back, because that's the same kind of experience. You're 15, you're 16, you're 17, you go and spend a few months living with a different family, seeing things from their perspective. Maybe if I was to make a curriculum recommendation, that would be the one that I would make.
And given UK higher education is different compared to many other countries where students seem much more mobile and travel away from home, I mean, that might be something quite interesting to compare with other countries, as it were, to see if that effect is strong.
We also have a very globalized university sector, right? So in smaller countries where universities are not such an enormous contributors to the economy, you will see a much more nationalistic university sector, whereas here we have people from all over the world, both as students and as staff. So I think that's an additional kind of influence.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, which I hadn't thought of. Well, look, I'm going to wrap things up now. So let me just thank both of you, Maria, Rob, for what has been really a stimulating discussion. And in particular, I think this notion of economics drives people's decision making is so deeply rooted in the way that the public thinks and policymakers tend to think. And your book is a very powerful corrective to that. And I think that will continue to play out for a long, long time. Now, let me just take this opportunity to tell our viewers about another event that's coming up, which might be of interest to them. The British Academy is holding an event on the 9th of March called Brits Abroad, the UK and its overseas citizens. And that features sociologist Dr. Michaela Benson, who will be in conversation with Mukti Jain Campion. And you can register for that event on the British Academy website. So it just remains really for me to thank you again both for speaking at this event, and to thank all of our audience for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the event, and look forward to seeing you again at a British Academy event in the future. Thank you.